September 1944 is marked in our calendars as a month of great bankruptcy. But bankruptcy is usually preceded by a boom, and until our tanks were stuck in the steel teeth of the Siegfried Line, we marched victoriously along the roads of Europe, filled with optimism and bright hopes. The defeat of the enemy east of Paris was so crushing that our troops, rushing forward in 2.5-ton trucks, began to consider such a rapid offensive as a harbinger of their imminent transfer to the Chinese-Burmese-Indian theatre of war. This sense of optimism even gripped headquarters, whose officers tirelessly accounted for vehicles and talked of the possibility of getting home in time for Christmas. To the northeast of Paris, where the roads literally sagged under the weight of columns of our heavy equipment, the enemy could no longer provide organized resistance, because the telephone communications in the whirlwind of forced retreat incessantly out of order. Well-trained soldiers of the Wehrmacht, from whom only 4 years ago French refugees were fleeing in panic along these roads, were now fleeing in terror. The enemy, deprived of means of communication, lost control of troops. Unable to tie rearguard fighting, he rushed haphazardly to the borders of the Reich and once again defeated this time at Mons. On 2 September, the 7th Corps Collins, providing the flank of the offensive on Brussels troops Monty, crossed the Belgian border. Collins directed his troops to Mons, where the Kaiser's army had faced the British Expeditionary Force in 1914. Scattered units of 20 German divisions, retreating under the onslaught of Monty's army from the Normandy bridgehead and the Pas de Calais area, were approaching Mons from the North Sea coast. Enemy troops, in disarray retreating to the German border, which near Aachen wedge into the territory of Belgium, near the city of Mons collided with the Corps Collins. The clash was unexpected for both sides. A counter-battle ensued. When it ended, the Germans lost more than 2,000 soldiers and officers killed and 30,000 prisoners. This battle at Mons cost the enemy the last reserves of the 7th and 15th Armies. From now on, the roads of Belgium were free up to the borders of the Reich. Hodges not only opened a way to Liège and Aachen, but also destroyed the last reserves, which the enemy desperately needed to cover the ungarrisoned fortifications of the Siegfried Line. It was this little-known victory at Mons that enabled the First Army to break through the Siegfried Line and capture Aachen 6 weeks later. In other parts of the front, where our columns were advancing eastwards, the enemy's retreat took the form of a disorderly rout. In the strip of the 21st Army Group, a German general was taken prisoner, travelling in his staff car to the north, lost in a column of British lorries. The soldiers mistook the German for a British Air Force officer, and he travelled on his way until he was discovered by the all-seeing eye of the military police. "Where the hell are you going?" came the policeman's question. The German was on his way to the Somme. He had orders to organise the defence of that line. Only now he learnt that the British had crossed the Somme 2 days ago. In the offensive strip of the First Army of the German withdrawal routes intersected with the axis of the offensive Hodges. Here we were exposed to the risk of unexpected collision with enemy columns. But at least this time our columns sped through the intersection with lightning speed, as if on a demonstration march. Major General Edward Brooks placed his car at a crossroads near Cambrai to watch the columns of his 2nd Armoured Division. As the tail of the division passed the crossroads, a panting French farmer came flying towards the general, pushing hard on the pedals of his bicycle. "Bolches, Bolches," he shouted, pointing back the way he had come. "How many?" Brooks asked, signalling his radio operator to switch on the transmitter mounted in the jeep. "Many, many," the Frenchman replied, panting. Brooks turned some of his tanks just in time to capture the enemy as they approached the crossroads. Encouraged by reports of the complete disorganization of the Germans, I watched Brest closely, trying to find the key to unravel the incomprehensible to me persistence with which the enemy defended this fortress. In spite of the hopelessness of its position, the garrison of Brest repelled the blows of 3 American divisions, so I was not inclined to take for granted the predictions of a complete defeat of the Germans before we reached the Rhine. Maybe there, on the Rhine, the Germans will realize the pointlessness of further resistance and try to save what can still be saved. To do this, they will have to admit their defeat before they suffocate in the grip between our front and the Russians. But if the enemy were to make resistance on the Rhine, we could assume with full confidence that he would fight to the end. Thus, in order to bring the end of the war closer, we had to break through to the Rhine and force the enemy to capitulate. But we could only hope to reach the Rhine on condition that we maintained the tempo of the offensive, taken by us after the breakthrough at St. Lo, until we overcome the Siegfried Line. For by the rapid pace of our advance, the enemy could easily conclude that our supply lines were overloaded. If he had been able to hold us up on the Siegfried Line, he could have forced us to stop to regroup and resupply. Either he had to stop us at the Siegfried Line, or he had to roll back dar Rhein. Logically, the enemy should have surrendered at the stage when our offensive turned into a pursuit, for it was during the next 8 months of the war that Germany suffered the heaviest casualties and was subjected to the fiercest aerial bombardment. Moreover, if the German army had dropped Hitler before it was crushed before the eyes of a German people gripped by doubt and distrust, it could have maintained the myth of its invincibility by attributing the defeat to the Nazis. But any hope of revolt against Hitler was by this time lost. The extraordinary measures taken by Himmler after the assassination attempt on Hitler on 20th July had silenced the German army. As for the Nazis themselves, they certainly could have no hesitation, for there was no other way out for them. They, more than anyone else, were aware of the fact that their crimes would not go unpunished. In their endeavor to prolong their miserable lives for a few more weeks or months, they preferred to drag the whole German people with them into the abyss. One clear September morning, as I was sitting in my trailer near Chartres, busy calculating the required number of vehicles for the advance to the Rhine, suddenly there was a light knock at the door, and a slouching man in a battered military uniform appeared on the threshold. In his hand he held a worn helmet. A faint smile wandered across his tired face. It was Ernie Pyle, our constant companion since the Sicilian campaign. "Ernie!" I exclaimed. "Ernie, come in. I hear you're going home." He threw his helmet on the leather sofa, nodded his head, and smiled with an effort. "I've just arrived from Paris, Brad, and I want to say goodbye. Will you be coming back?" Ernie shook his head in the negative and shrugged his shoulders under his baggy tank jacket. "Get some rest, you've had enough." "Too much," he agreed. Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, and now France, 22 months of fighting. 22 months. And how many friends had to be wrapped up in mattress covers in which we buried our soldiers and officers? For a man who had suffered it all, like Pyle, it was quite enough, even too much. Ernie had owed a huge number of lines during his last illness, and now he was heroically climbing out of debt by sending off a new message every day. The worst of it, Ernie said, was that he had written himself out. The war had squeezed every last drop out of him. "A couple of months off," I said, "and you'll be back with us at the front." Ernie squeezed out another smile. "They say the war will be over by then." Maybe I agreed. But if the enemy put up the same kind of resistance that Ramke is putting up in Brest, who knows how long it will last? Now is the time to end the war, but all the signs say otherwise. If the Germans don't lay down their arms on the Rhine, we may have to shred them into little pieces before they surrender." Pyle looked at me in surprise. "The closer you get to the front, the more optimistic people are, especially in the First Army." I shrugged. "Maybe because everything seems to be going so smoothly right now." Ernie was back in Paris in time for breakfast. I never saw him again. One evening at a dinner in Wiesbaden, just 6 days before the meeting with the Russians, I was handed a telegram telegraphed by Hugh Bailey of the United Press. Ernie had been killed by a Japanese machine gunner on an island near Okinawa. American soldiers had lost their best frontline friend. Somewhat puzzled by the ease with which Monty was advancing northeast of the scene, the General Command of the Allied Expeditionary Force revised its offensive strategy in eastern France, and on 4th September decided not to prevent Patton from advancing on the Saar. The High Command believed that in the conditions of complete demoralization of the enemy could provide supplies to Patton's army without damage to Monty. Although the main Allied effort was still directed toward supporting Monty's offensive, this time the High Command began to lean toward our two operational offensive strategy. Instead of turning all 3 corps of the First Army north of the Ardennes, Hodges was to support Monty's offensive with 2 corps, and the 3rd Corps, covering this forest barrier from the south, to support Patton's advance on Frankfurt. Such a double strike north and south of the Ardennes unexpectedly brought us tactical luck. Eisenhower was no longer bound to a single axis of offensive on which the enemy could concentrate his means of defense. Attacking on a broad front on 2 directions, Eisenhower was able to maneuver and hide from the enemy his intentions. If the German command concentrated its troops in the north to repel the offensive on the Ruhr, it would be forced to weaken the defense of Saar and would put this section of the front under the attack of Patton's army. On the other hand, if it concentrated its troops in the Saar, it could only do so at the risk of a British breakthrough in the north. While we held the initiative in our hands on a wide front, the enemy's defense line inevitably overstretched and our troops had a full opportunity to break through it. By 1st September on the Western Front remained a pitiful handful of demoralized enemy soldiers. The total number of all surviving German troops north of the Ardennes was only 11 divisions, of which tank divisions were only 2. The enemy could counter Patton's Saar offensive with no more than 5 divisions. True, from the coast of the Bay of Biscay retreated 100,000 German army, but from these 100,000 troops could be recruited combat-ready units for no more than 1 division. As for the numerous enemy troops retreating upstream of the Rhone under the onslaught of the 7th American Army, from them it was possible to complete no more than 2.5 combat-ready divisions. Thus, the total number of German troops on the Western Front barely reached 20 divisions. While the enemy's forces were melting, to us across the English Channel continuously crossed reinforcements and our forces were growing. By this time in the Army Group Monty had 15 divisions, while in my group has increased to 20. In addition, after the completion of Operation Dragoon, 8 more divisions were released and were moving from Cannes up the Rhone River Valley. In addition, 3 airborne divisions were stationed in England, forming the reserve of the 1st Allied Airborne Army. Another 4 divisions on the way from the United States, according to the plan, was to arrive at the disposal of the 12th Army Group in mid-September. However, when entering the German border, we lost the overwhelming superiority in strength. There we had to overcome a strip of fortifications known as the Siegfried Line, where the Germans had built strong concrete structures that offset our superiority in divisions. In order to reach the Rhine, it was important for us to capture the defences of the Siegfried Line before the enemy came to his senses and garrisoned them. Otherwise, our superiority in troops could be neutralized by the enemy's pillboxes and fortress artillery. With regard to logistical issues, the transition of the supreme headquarters of the Allies to the offensive strategy in two operational directions was very favorable to Patton, because in connection with the order to resume the offensive on the Saar Third Army, Patton was equalized in rights to supply with the First Army Hodges. Despite the promise of full equality of supply, however, Patton's travails did not end there, for he, like Hodges, suffered not so much from lack of supplies as from lack of vehicles. It was becoming increasingly obvious that sooner or later we would have to stop, regroup our troops and organize supply through the new deep water ports on the Strait coast north of the Seine. Until these new, shorter communications were mastered, we dared not even think of forcing the Rhine with a large force. In the meantime, we intended to move forward, while we still had the offensive impulse, and to overcome the Siegfried Line with a move. A less belligerent commander than Patton might have saved the meagre crumbs that fell to his lot and halted for a quiet winter under the cover of the Maas River. But George boldly rushed forward and went 50 kilometers beyond the Meuse, reached the Moselle and quickly captured the pre-bridge fortification south of the fortress of Metz. On the sunny afternoon of 13th September, tanks of the 3rd Armoured Division of the 7th Corps crossed the German border on a weakly defended section of the Siegfried Line 16 kilometers south of Aachen. The German army, which had successfully invaded Western Europe 3 times in the last 70 years, was now rolling back into its own country for the first time. I learned of this in Doux, a few kilometers east of Paris, where the task force of the 12th Army Group headquarters was completing preparations to move to Verdun. But the news of the German border crossing could not hide the fact that our offensive had run out of steam. No sooner had our troops crossed the border than we were forced to halt. The 6th week of the dizzying campaign was over. For the next 2 months we were forced to stand still in front of the Siegfried Line, waiting for the long supply lines from Cherbourg to be replaced by shorter ones from Antwerp. Having received reinforcements from the areas east of the Rhine, the enemy somehow regained his position on the front. Our dash to the Rhine was unsuccessful, and with it our cherished dream of a speedy surrender of Germany was dispelled. The morning before the day Collins crossed the German border, I invited Hodges and Patton to my command post to review with them our ability to continue the offensive despite the worsening crisis with fuel and ammunition. That evening of the same day I reported the results of our meeting to Ike. During the previous 10 days, the First Army had averaged 3,300 tons of supplies a day, the Third Army 2,500 tons. For the First Army's supply advantage had not been lifted until 6th September. Hodges reported that he had ammunition left for 5 days of fighting and enough petrol to reach the Rhine. Based on his army's supply rates, Hodges estimated that he could sustain 10 days of intense fighting along the First Army's nearly 200-kilometer front. Patton reported that he had a 4-day supply of ammunition and enough petrol to reach the Rhine. 5 days earlier, Montgomery had complained that the transfer of some petrol to Patton had slowed the pace of the advance of Hodges's First Army, which was advancing on the British right flank. Courtney acknowledged that he may have lost as much as 24 hours due to fuel shortages. However, the main reason for the delay of his army, he explained the difficulty of building crossings across the Meuse and noticeably strengthened enemy resistance. By the end of September, fuel supplies in the First Army were exhausted, and Hodges failed to break through the stubbornly defended by the enemy Siegfried Line. Before the November rains came, he was forced to confine himself to minor actions, and in November we once again tried to take the offensive. On the southern section of the front below the Ardennes forests, Patton's 80th Division captured a bridgehead on the east bank of the Moselle River between the towns of Metz and Nancy. But when George attempted to expand this bridgehead and bring additional troops across the river, he unexpectedly encountered strong enemy resistance. On 12th September, I gave Patton 2 more days to get the main force across the Moselle. If Patton could not complete this task in 2 days, he would have to go on the defensive on the front from Nancy and north to Luxembourg, and then begin the offensive north of the Moselle River, where it at Trier turns to the east. George needed no prodding. Still not giving up hope to break through to the Rhine, he forced the Moselle on an 80-kilometre front, and in the evening of 14th September reported that 4 divisions safely crossed the river. But by this time Patton had almost completely used up the meagre supplies and, like Hodges, had reached the limit of his forces. Nearly a fortnight before, Monty and I had agreed on the direction in which our troops would advance on the Rhine after Brussels remained in our rear. For this offensive we were to allocate 2 corps, Monty 1. According to our plan, all 3 corps moved in a single line and struck in the section between Düsseldorf and Bonn. Meanwhile, the left flank corps of the 2nd British Army Dempsey had to turn to the northeast, and the 1st Canadian Army to go to the coast of the Strait. There it was to seize the ports and sites from which the shelling of London by aeroplanes was conducted, and continue the offensive to the Scheldt, an inland waterway connecting Antwerp with the sea. To the right of the direction of the main strike, the remaining corps Hodges was to block the Ardennes with a small force and advance along the Moselle River valley in the direction of Koblenz. Patton's 2 left flank corps south of the Ardennes were advancing towards the Saar. The 3rd Corps was to advance, if it had sufficient strength, north of the Vosges towards Karlsruhe on the Rhine. While Crérar's Canadian Army, advancing from line to line, was moving towards the Straits ports, Dempsey's army had liberated Brussels and Antwerp. From Antwerp it was to advance eastwards to the Meuse, advancing in line with Hodges' army. From Namur to Liège the Meuse flows eastwards. At Liège it turns north again and carries its waters to the sea. On the 4th of September Montgomery captured Antwerp, but beyond Antwerp he, like us, met with suddenly increased German resistance. This resistance was organized by a Prussian Field Marshal Walter Model, who the previous summer had stopped the Russian advance on the Vistula and for this was rewarded by Hitler. After von Kluge's suicide, Hitler appointed Model to the Western Front, tasking him with rebuilding the defense line. Model, one of the most enterprising and resourceful German generals, managed to delay the defeat of the Wehrmacht. He stopped the panic and reorganized the demoralized German troops, forming them into stable fighting groups. On the front from Antwerp to Epinal, 415 kilometers long, Model miraculously created a new powerful defensive line. In early September, Montgomery concluded that he could end the war in one skillful stroke by advancing from the Rhine to Berlin through the Netherlands. Instead of forcing his way to the Ruhr, using also attached to him 3 corps of the First Army, Monty decided a bold dash north to outflank the new defensive line created by Modella. This risky gamble ended in a major Allied defeat at Arnhem. This adventure of Monty's struck a chord with me. It seems that if this devout teetotaler fell into the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force drunkenly, I would not have been so surprised. This time Montgomery changed his inherent caution. The plan for the Arnhem operation called for an airborne landing 100 kilometers deep. Although I could never reconcile with this risky venture, nevertheless readily admit that in drawing up the plan for the Arnhem operation, Montgomery showed great power of imagination. Arnhemskaya operation, which received the conventional name of Market Garden, aimed to cut into the enemy's defences for 100 kilometres. If the operation would be crowned with success, Montgomery would flank the defences of the Siegfried Line and, having crossed the Lower Rhine, would go on the shortest road to Berlin. But the route between Antwerp and Monty's goal of Arnhem was blocked by 5 major water obstacles. The first 2 were canals north of Eindhoven. The third was the Maas River 40 kilometres to the east. 13 kilometres beyond the Maas flows the River Waal, over which the arch bridge in Nijmegen spans. Finally, the Lower Rhine represented the last barrier before the weakly fortified German border, which was only 30 kilometres away. 3 airborne divisions were to seize crossings over these water obstacles. It was supposed to throw the 101st Division in Eindhoven, 82nd in Nijmegen, and the 1st English near Arnhem. Montgomery entrusted the task of linking these 3 isolated bridgeheads to his selected Guards armoured division. I was not privy to this plan and heard about it from our liaison officer to the 21st Army Group a few days after Montgomery presented it to Ike in final form. The secrecy in which Monty kept the entire planning of the operation puzzled me. Although the British had not gone beyond their allotted strip, still their actions violated the plan of joint offensive approved a few days earlier. Deviation to the northeast of the intended direction, in which Montgomery recently put into battle one of his corps, exposed the left flank of Hodges and put it in danger of a counterattack of the Germans. To cover this flank, I would have to take from Patton one of his 3 armoured divisions, move it to the north and put it at the disposal of Hodges. Upon learning of Monty's plan, I immediately called Ike and strongly protested. By refusing to launch a joint offensive, Monty wanted to pull ahead, leaving us in place. However, Ike hushed the matter up. He believed the gamble was worth it. If Monty's scheme had succeeded, we would have outflanked Siegfried's line and maybe even captured a bridgehead on the east bank of the Rhine. Each new division arriving in France increased the preponderance of American forces over British forces. By 15th September, Monty had finished amassing forces for the offensive. The only thing missing was 3 Canadian divisions, which were due to arrive from the Mediterranean area in April. Fearing lest Ike might give in to Monty's unyielding pleas for reinforcements, I defended with unwavering firmness the right of American troops to fight under American command. But my opposition to the Arnhem operation was not merely because the British had violated a previously approved plan. It seemed to me that Monty, who sought at all costs to bypass the flank of Model, underestimated the strength of the Germans in the Lower Rhine. I thought that Monty's claims are unfounded and do not correspond to his forces. He should have concentrated his attention on the Scheldt region and opened the port of Antwerp. As long as this port could not be used to unload Allied ships, we could not launch an offensive east of the Rhine. On Sunday, 17th September, the skies over Holland were darkened by countless aircraft of the Allied Airborne Army under Brereton. It was the first daytime airborne ejection of the entire war. In the evening, I arrived at Monty's command post in Brussels, where several downed C-47 aircraft sat on the belly. Despite frequent enemy counterattacks, the paratroopers held the captured bridgeheads. Monty's tanks broke through and on 20th September slipped over the bridge in Nijmegen on the east bank of the Waal River. However, between Waal and Arnhem, the Guards' armoured division met increased enemy resistance and halted. Meanwhile, the enemy continuously counterattacked the British 1st Airborne Division on the east bank of the Lower Rhine. For 5 days, British paratroopers in red berets defended the captured bridgehead, until 25th September Monty, despairing of the success of the operation, gave them the order to withdraw behind the Rhine. Of the 9,000 British paratroopers thrown east of the Rhine, less than 2,500 returned. A distinctive feature of the British is that their valour is especially brightly manifested in a difficult moment, and as a result, heroic actions are often so overshadowed by defeats that the memory of them is preserved for centuries, while the defeats have long been forgotten. The Battle of Arnhem confirmed this English tradition. Monty was forced to turn back, almost reaching his goal, and his troops showed such valour that the strategic failure went unnoticed. True, the English captured a pre-bridge fortification across the Vaal, but it cost them great sacrifice. Only 6 months later, Monty managed to force the Rhine, but that at a distance of almost 80 kilometres upriver from Arnhem. Meanwhile, the actions to clear the Scheldt from the enemy, pushed to the background, dragged on throughout October. And only by 26 November, this extremely important for the Allies route was finally opened for shipping. Monty later attributed the failure in Arnhem unfavourable weather conditions. No doubt, the weather played a role here. Thus, on the second day of the offensive, overcast weather, established in the Netherlands, disrupted the delivery of supplies and reinforcements by air. During the entire operation, Allied fighter aviation had only 2 flying days. All the rest of the time, bad weather limited its actions, and the enemy was able to move into counterattacks without fear of airstrikes. During the period from 19th September, when the Guards' Armoured Division reached Nijmegen, to 4th October, when Monty refused a further offensive, the enemy 12 times counterattacked wedged British troops, and each counterattack involved up to a division. Monty grudgingly admitted that his easy path was strewn with hidden thorns. In preparation for a meeting of the Army Group commanders at the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, scheduled for 22nd September, Eisenhower asked each of us for our opinion on the strategic plan that should be the basis for the conquest of the Reich itself. We in the task force of the Army Group headquarters knew in advance that Monty would demand in the first place to ensure his action in the northern direction. At the time, Monty believed that if his army group was reinforced by American divisions, he would be able to one throw to force the Rhine, invade the Ruhr and pave the way to Berlin. It seemed to me that he greatly underestimated the enemy reserves on the other side of the Rhine. I was sure that Monty's plan was built on sand and his plans would be frustrated by an enemy strike in the flank of the advancing British. For several weeks, we in the headquarters of the 12th Army Group studied the plan for a 2-pronged coverage of the Ruhr. Monty believed that he will force the Rhine, and we will cover his flank, so we do not need to go to the Rhine south of Cologne. In my opinion, we should go to the Rhine on a broad front, which would stretch southwards, at least to Koblenz, or better still to the Swiss border. In presenting my point of view to Ike, I drew his attention to 3 points. 1. Until we have completely cleared the Scheldt from the enemy and not secure Antwerp, we cannot count on a major offensive east of the Rhine. 2. In any advance into German territory, we must move in an echeloned manner, keeping large forces in the rear to repel enemy counterattacks and fight sabotage. 3. Irrespective of the choice of the direction of the main blow, offensive actions should be organized in auxiliary directions. Only an offensive on a broad front can deprive the enemy of the opportunity to concentrate large forces in the direction of our main strike. Our main target was the Ruhr Basin, the heart of the German war machine, with its dense network of industrial centres and a forest of tall factory chimneys. Fed by its rich deposits of hard coal, the Ruhr came to play a predominant role during Bismarck's First Empire. Beginning in 1942, the Ruhr withstood hundreds of Allied air raids. After each bombardment, the wreckage was removed, the damage repaired, and war production continued again. Although the aircraft eventually caused great damage to the Ruhr, it still failed to disable the main industrial plants. Without the Ruhr, Germany would not have been able to supply its armies at the front. In order to extinguish this giant blast furnace, I suggested that Eisenhower isolate it by means of bilateral coverage. While Monty covered the Ruhr from the north, moving across the plains of Westphalia, we surrounded it from the south. The shortest route for our covering blow was the road east of Cologne, but it looped through the mountains of Sauerland, where the terrain favored the organization of defense. Much more convenient was the southern road, which ran from Frankfurt northeastwards through the hills of Hesse. Perhaps we will use both ways. I wrote, but for the main strike we will choose the route through Frankfurt and complete the encirclement of the Ruhr in the area of Paderborn. This city was located on the northeastern border of the Ruhr, only 230 kilometers from Berlin. 6 months later, when in the Ruhr bag was more than 300,000 troops of Army Group Model, we closed the ring of encirclement in Lippstadt, only 32 kilometers from the point we had planned in September. We acted exactly according to plan. Still, hardly the fulfillment of any plan was accompanied by such incredible difficulties that we had to overcome, until Eisenhower opened a green street for us. The supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force moved from the modest seaside town of Granville in Versailles, located near the palace. Dick's office was housed in a small white stone wing behind the stately building of the Trianon Palace Hotel. In the mirrored lobby, a bronze bust of Goering was turned to face the wall. Ike was initially assigned a huge room, but then at his insistence the hall was partitioned off with a plywood wall. "It's too elegant," he said, shrugging his shoulders. "I'll hang around here like a loner and end up lost." Devers arrived by plane in Versailles from the headquarters of the 6th Army Group, located near the Vosges Mountains. His group now consisted of 2 armies, the American 7th, under Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, and the French 1st under General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny. Manned initially by Free French volunteers in North Africa, colonial soldiers and officers, and local military units, the French army was armed with American weapons and wore American uniforms. Meanwhile, another American army had joined the 12th Army Group. This was the 9th Army, which had arrived from England to replace the units of Patton's 3rd Army blockading the ports of Brittany. The 9th Army was an untrained but ambitious army eager to fight. It quickly matured under the leadership of Lieutenant General William Simpson. Compared to the boisterous and arrogant 3rd and temperamental 1st Armies, the 9th Army was nothing special. I first sensed that things were not going smoothly at the meetings at Versailles only after Hansen told me that the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force had a bet would Monty turn up for the meeting or not. So I was not surprised when the meeting was opened by Freddy de Guignan, Monty's skillful conciliator, who represented his superior at the meeting. Although Eisenhower maintained a nonchalant appearance, Monty's absence was seen by the other commanders as an insult to the commander-in-chief of the Allied armed forces. True, the situation at Arnhem was critical, but I am sure Monty could have carved out a few free hours that day if he wished. Monty's absence from the meeting limited the scope of our work. Although de Guignan arrived as Monty's representative, ready to present his point of view, he could not make any commitments for his chief. If Ike was unhappy about Monty's absence, he concealed his feelings with remarkable composure. 2 days later, I myself was unhappy with the commission to visit Monty and acquaint him with the decisions taken at Versailles. We flew out to Monty's headquarters. The weather was abominable. Our plane went off course and almost hit the enemy's position, because we had a radio station out of order. Now the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, as urgently as we at Army Group headquarters demanded the opening of some nearby major port in order to relieve some of our overloaded communications stretching from Cherbourg and various points on the coast. Although Monty had captured the city of Antwerp 17 days before, he had still done little to free the mouth of the Scheldt from the enemy. And until this waterway was opened, Antwerp could be of no use to us. At a meeting at Versailles on 22nd September, Ike emphasized that we needed a deep water port. He said that this port would be a necessary prerequisite for a decisive offensive deep into Germany. Despite this, however, Eisenhower did not suggest that Monty first clear the Scheldt before moving on. Instead, he guaranteed him that British troops during the Ruhr offensive would be supplied first. In the direction of the main strike was to operate the 2nd British Army Dempsey, which was supported by the 1st American Army Hodges, covering the right flank of the British. Eisenhower's decision was a devastating blow to Patton, who had hoped to obtain permission for a rapid offensive to the Rhine in the direction of Frankfurt. Clarifying the task assigned to the First Army, the Supreme Commander ordered the rest of the troops of the 12th Army Group to take no further offensive action until the logistical possibilities are identified after first meeting all the requirements of the group operating in the direction of the main strike. In ordinary language, this meant that the American Third Army was to sit back on the Moselle. In order to help Monty concentrate his troops on a narrow section of the front, I received an order to move the boundary line of the 12th Army Group another 65 kilometers to the north and clear the enemy territory west of the Maas, which remained in the rear of Monty. Eisenhower then took measures to facilitate the supply of American troops in the southern section of the front, ordering us to transfer Haslip Corps of 2 divisions to Army Group Diversa. In accordance with this plan, Hodges' troops stretched along a 150-kilometer stretch of the front from the Ruhr almost to the Moselle. Therefore, to the right of Hodges' army in the Ardennes Section 1 placed the 9th Army Simpson. The front in the Ardennes area, east of which is the Eifel Massif, seemed calm. The Ardennes are almost impassable mountains covered with forest, crossing the Luxembourg border. It was not until 9th October that Monty finally became convinced of the impossibility of a rapid advance through the Rhineland to the northern border of the Ruhr. After 20 days of fighting on a narrow front between the Vaal River and the lower Rhine, Dempsey had failed to break enemy resistance. Moreover, there was a threat that the model will hit the open flank of the British from the pre-bridge fortification west of the Maas, bypassed by Monty in an attempt to capture Arnhem. The airborne landing, thrown out by Montgomery in Arnhem, failed to divert the enemy from the mouth of the Scheldt and end the blockade of the important port of Antwerp. At the end of September, von Rundstedt, retired, was again called to active service and appointed commander of the Western Front. Clearly aware of our difficulties with supply, he realized that the blockade of Antwerp will delay a new Allied offensive. And while the Canadians paved the way to the Scheldt along the North Sea coast, the enemy crossed to the island of Walcheren, entrenched there, and then strengthened on the peninsula connecting Walcheren with the mainland. When Monty suspended the offensive in October to count his supplies, he found that there was insufficient cash to resume the offensive. Not wanting to overload his rear, he agreed to postpone indefinitely the offensive on the Ruhr in order to first clear the mouth of the Scheldt from the enemy and open the port of Antwerp. Meanwhile, 18 precious days had passed since the meeting at Versailles on 22nd September, at which Eisenhower had stressed the importance of Antwerp. 35 days ago, the British 11th Armoured Division had entered Antwerp, located at the mouth of the Scheldt River. Had Monty immediately set about clearing the Scheldt of the enemy, instead of tearing in vain towards Berlin, we might already be receiving supplies through this Belgian port. Instead, he lost a whole month, and we had to wait another month until our first naval convoy arrived in Antwerp. Had Monty cleared the Scheldt, as suggested to him by the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, Antwerp would have become operational much sooner, and we would have avoided the supply crisis that paralyzed us in October. Indeed, of all the possible failures on the European front, none was fraught with more serious consequences than Monty's belated opening of the port of Antwerp. Had we been able to secure a rapid supply of supplies to the front via Antwerp, we could have launched the autumn offensive much sooner. Instead, we were forced to sit out until November, when we had accumulated fuel and ammunition supplies delivered by the long route from Cherbourg to the front. By this time the weather had turned bad, winter had set in, and the Germans were not sitting idle. During the period from early September to mid-December, the enemy tripled the number of his troops on the Western Front, bringing it to 70 divisions. And of his 15 armoured divisions, 8 of them were armed with tanks such as Panther and Tiger. When finally Monty gave up Arnhem and decided to proceed to free from the enemy approaches to Antwerp, Eisenhower was particularly concerned about the fate of this port, in which we felt the utmost need. Therefore, he made it clear to Montgomery in very unequivocal terms that Antwerp must be opened before we undertake any offensive towards the Rhine. Montgomery had so long delayed the liberation of the mouth of the Scheldt from the enemy that it had now become a very difficult operation. To capture the island of Valheeren, Canadians had to land a naval landing. Our aviation, seeking to flood the enemy positions, bombed the dams on the island. As a result, the Canadians had to make their way in extremely difficult conditions, overcoming fields flooded with seawater. Finally, on 9th November, the headquarters of the 21st Army Group reported that the mouth of the Scheldt is free, and 17 days later, on 26th November, in Antwerp stood under unloading ships of the first Allied convoy. In a few weeks, Antwerp completely replaced Cherbourg, with its long and troublesome lines of communication. The positional warfare which paralyzed our armies for 6 murderously long weeks, while supplies were being brought from Cherbourg with great difficulty, began soon after the meeting at Versailles. Patton was the first to receive orders to hold the positions occupied until supplies could be built up to permit the resumption of the offensive. 2 weeks later, on 9th October, when Montgomery had to abandon the advance to the Rhine, the enforced inactivity to which Patton was doomed extended also to the First Army. In this regard, our hopes for a quick defeat of the German army faded. 29th September, I reported to Eisenhower my thoughts on Antwerp. I believe that Monty, in the best case, will not release the Scheldt before the beginning of November, and the port of Antwerp will not be able to provide us with substantial assistance until 1st December. The best we could hope for, I concluded, was to launch the offensive in mid-November. Hodges was to stockpile supplies for this November offensive and, using his incursion into the Siegfried Line, capture the city of Aachen to make it a stronghold in Reich territory. Later, when his field depots were again replenished with supplies, he was to move towards the Rhine, towards the Gothic towers of Cologne. Although hopes of victory this autumn were not fulfilled, the soldiers had not forgotten the rapid pace of our September offensive. For many it was quite incomprehensible how the defeated armies of the enemy could again gather strength and resist such a powerful strike fist as the 7 Allied armies concentrated on the Western Front. On 28th September, the First Army headquarters sent me a magnificent bronze bust of Hitler with the following inscription on the pedestal found in the Nazi headquarters in Eupen, Germany. Give the First Army 7 munitions and another division, and we undertake to deliver the original in 30 days. Before those 30 days had passed, however, Hitler had already familiarized his generals with the plan for a counter-offensive in the Ardennes. One evening, for a few short hours, it even looked as if the First Army might even be able to deliver the original sooner than hoped. Hodges' Army Chief of Intelligence burst into his van with a radio intelligence report. The intercepted radiogram stated that an SS colonel had handed von Rundstedt in Cologne an order from the German High Command to immediately launch a counteroffensive. Von Rundstedt refused to carry out the order, stating that to do so would result in the destruction of his troops. An argument ensued and the SS colonel was shot dead. It was further reported that the field marshal ordered the troops to disarm the SS units and at the same time announced that he was assuming full authority in Cologne. Further, he allegedly appealed on the radio to the German people to support him and allow him to make an honorable peace with the Allies. All this turned out to be a bluff. When the Chief of Intelligence again contacted his radio interception unit and demanded confirmation, it turned out that the intercepted message did not come from Cologne, but from a Luxembourg radio station, which the 12th Army Group was using for so-called black propaganda, that is, to transmit false information intended to deceive the German people and undermine their morale. Our restrictions on the Third Army's actions in September were more severe than those by which we later restrained Hodges. For George Patton, who had the deepest aversion to defensive warfare, the order to halt and go on the defensive was a cruel and heavy blow. Until his death, Patton was deeply convinced that if he, rather than Monty and Hodges, had had priority in supplies, the Third Army would have broken through the Saar to the Rhine. Monty's offer to keep the Third Army on the Moselle while he marched victoriously to Berlin did little to diminish the undisguised dislike with which Patton regarded the British Field Marshal. However, it was difficult to expect from Patton complete inaction. During the month of October, he repeatedly made unauthorized sorties against fortified enemy positions in the Metz area. When I learnt of this, I tried to dissuade him. "For God's sake, George, stop it," I said. "I will give you an opportunity to distinguish yourself when we go on the offensive again. Then you can easily outflank Metz and take it from the rear. Why bang your head against the wall?" George nodded his head in agreement, but did not stop his forays against Metz. "We are attacking Metz," he explained, "to test our new divisions in battle." Although I was annoyed at the persistence with which George continued to raid the German fortifications at Metz, I did not make a fuss. These attacks seldom involved more than one battalion, and I certainly could not forbid the army commander to make an attack with a battalion. During this period, Patton was restless and irritable. He was thrashing about the troops of his army like a caged tiger. When one of the corps commanders, whom George disliked terribly because of some past clash, positioned his corps on a bivouac in his army's strip, Patton burst into the corps command post for a preliminary inspection. The further the army commander's acquaintance with the new corps went, the more irritable he became. Walking down the darkened corridor of the schoolhouse where the corps headquarters was located, George tripped over the motionless figure of a dozing soldier. Awakened by Patton's boot kicking him in the side, the soldier muttered into the darkness, "Damn you, dummy, watch your step. Can't you see I want to sleep?" Patton's breath caught and he roared, "You're the first son of a bitch here who knows what he's doing." Towards the end of September, complaints began to come in from Communications Zone headquarters about the organized theft of cargo coming from Cherbourg. Thousands of gallons of petrol, tonners of food and uniforms were finding their way into the French black market every day. In desperation, Lee begged Ike to commit several infantry battalions to guard his rear depots. I informed Patton of Lee's request. A furious Patton rushed to his command post and dictated a formal letter to me outlining his objections. Already by the address Dear General Bradley, I realized that this letter belonged among those official documents which George had reserved for history. His usual form of address to me was Dear Brad, as one of your subordinate commanders of armies. George wrote, I consider it my duty to bring to your attention in the most convincing manner that the use of combat units, especially infantry, for any other purpose than fighting against the Germans, I consider the biggest mistake. If the Communications Zone Command can use vehicles to transport soldiers from the front to Paris, the armies can certainly find the necessary vehicles to transport soldiers from Paris to the front. Lee later realized he had made a mistake and apologized. He did without our help, formed from the non-staff of the Communications Zone several Guard battalions. These battalions were manned by soldiers deemed unfit for military service. Hardly had we come to terms with the gloomy prospect of a protracted winter campaign when I called from the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force to inform us that General Marshall was coming to the front. Marshall arrived at Verdun on the 7th of October. He flew at low altitude over the Argonne Heights to look at the terrain familiar to him from the First World War. From his first words, it was clear that the sobering breath of reality that had made us reconsider our September calculations about the end of the war had not yet reached Washington and the War Department. We had already got used to the idea of having to wait languidly for the end of the war, while Marshall spoke of affairs on the front still with the cheerfulness we had lost 3 weeks earlier. Marshall approved of our plans for the November offensive and predicted that under our onslaught the enemy would undoubtedly prefer to surrender than to expose himself to the trials of another harsh winter, such a divergence of views among persons at different levels of command. A common phenomenon in a large war, when the highest headquarters are hundreds and thousands of kilometers away from the front. In their assessment of the front situation, they are usually weeks behind the commanders in the field. The most typical example of this is the battle in the Ardennes. We have long ago won a victory at the front, and the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force was still in a state of anxiety and complete uncertainty. General Marshall demanded that we should not disturb the usual routine on account of his arrival. He intended to stay some time at the front to familiarize himself with the training and equipment of our troops. Nevertheless, on 8th October I insisted on flying with him in a C-47 to see Hodges and Monty. Normally our C-47 aircraft flew without fighter escort. Lieutenant General Hoyt Vandenberg's 9th Air Army was so thoroughly scouring the skies that the appearance of German aircraft in the air was a rarity for us. Robinson, however, still preferred to fly a shave to avoid encountering enemy fighters. Fearing that German intelligence would not get wind of our flight, we called in fighters from the 9th Tactical Air Command to escort our C-47, which was parked at an improvised airfield set up in a pasture near the outflowing Mars. The fighters were to meet us in the air directly over Verdun. We got into the aeroplane and Robinson began to taxi to the end of the field to warm up the engines. Suddenly he turned the plane sharply to the side and swerved out of the lane. The first fighter coming in for a landing almost landed on our heads. We had no radio contact with the fighters. Our desperate attempts to show them not to land on the short unimproved walkway were unsuccessful. 2 P-47 heavy fighters, despite all our signals, slammed into the airfield like airborne tanks. When the 4th aircraft tried to turn away from the runway, the 8-ton machine got bogged down in the mud. An attempt was made to pull the aircraft out with a winch, but the P-47 buried its nose even deeper into the ground. Its tail blocked nearly 2/3 of the runway. I asked Robinson if he could go around it without hitting it and get airborne. Robbie released the brakes, opened the throttle, took his feet off the pedals, and we were off the ground. Despite the fact that the plane stuck in the mud was almost blocking the runway, the other 3 fighters also began to taxi for takeoff. The first passed only a few inches from the stuck aircraft and took off. The second crashed into the tail of an aircraft blocking the runway, somehow miraculously got airborne with damaged landing gear, and after struggling to gain altitude, set a course for its airfield. The third safely passed the damaged aircraft, flew at a strafing flight over the trees and joined our aircraft on the side. At Eindhoven, where Monty's headquarters were located, torn clouds covered the sky. Only by chance could the concrete runway be seen through the breaks in the clouds. Robinson made 2 approaches and finally landed safely on the third. Our 2 fighters descended lower and lower. The wing commander made an approach, then another, and another. On the 5th approach, he slid on the wing parallel to the runway. The fighter lost speed and plummeted to the ground. The engine was thrown aside. The machine tipped over almost at the end of the wing of our aircraft. A moment later, the fighter exploded, engulfed in flames. But the British had time to warn of the danger of the emergency vehicle, which was allocated specifically for the accident of our landing, and the explosion occurred almost under the very nozzles of its fire extinguishers. When the flames were knocked down, the emergency machine turned the aircraft over to its normal position. The rescue team opened the foam-covered cockpit. The pilot climbed out unaided with a grin on his young face. Meanwhile, the pilot of the 4th fighter was frightened by the flash of flame and did not go for a landing. Thus, in the space of an hour, we lost all 4 aircraft escorting us without any enemy action. Fortunately, General Marshall did not say a word. In the evening, Hansen contacted Air Headquarters by telephone and reported our losses. "Very bad," replied the colonel. "I will send you another 4. "No, thank you, Colonel," Hansen replied. "I'm sure the general will not wish to live through another day like this." We have never again asked the Air Corps for fighters to escort the Mary Kay. Early in October, a familiar spectre loomed again on the horizon. We began to experience the first signs of ammunition shortages, which silenced our artillery for a month. Our gasoline supplies were also dwindling, until finally, one day, the chief of the home front reported to me that there was only enough gasoline in the theatre for 2 days. I demanded that Lee increase petrol supplies, and the Communications Zone Command hastily set about building additional petrol storage tanks in Normandy. The ammunition shortage, however, proved to be a far more difficult problem. We could not resolve the matter quickly because of the lack of berthing facilities. Only the coming into operation of the Antwerp harbour could break the deadlock. Stormy weather delayed the unloading of ships off the Normandy coast, and only a few berths could be allocated for unloading ammunition ships in the Channel ports. During the first week of October, only 1 ammunition transport was unloaded. 35 other transports stood in the roadstead awaiting unloading. Meanwhile, the communications zone had used up all its reserves, and the amount of ammunition that came to the front directly from the transports could not meet even our minimum requirements. On 2nd October, that is, on the day when Hodges began the offensive on Aachen, we again introduced ammunition rationing. But after a week, we realized that even with this reduced fire regime, we would exhaust our supplies by 7th November. Although the Communications Zone Command could blame Monty for delaying the opening of the port of Antwerp, it was by no means blameless. Stocks in the Normandy depots were insufficient for all the firepower received by our armies in September. On 9th October, I called a meeting at the headquarters of the 12th Army Group to try to find a way out of the supply crisis, which threatened to delay the beginning of the November offensive. Patton appeared with his chief of staff and chief of the home front. Keane introduced Hodges. He arrived accompanied by Madaris and Wilson. When Patton saw Madaris, whom he knew from his joint service in the Second Corps as a man who could handle his business at the conference table, he hastily summoned his chief of artillery and technical services. "Look at this pair," Patton warned his chief of staff, nodding stealthily toward Madaris and Wilson. "I know these guys like the back of my hand. They worked for me at one time." George's warning was not unwarranted. No one knew better than he that the First Army well deserved its reputation as a pirate capable of brazenly seizing any supplies. Following the well-known adage that in love and war all means are good, the First Army continued to stockpile fuel and ammunition by any means necessary until Army headquarters noticed its shenanigans. At our request, Eisenhower summoned Bedell Smith from Versailles, together with the chief of the rear of the Allied Expeditionary Force headquarters, and invited him to explain to us the ammunition situation. Although Bedell sympathized with our difficulties, he nevertheless suspected that our discontent was partly due to the perennial antagonism between the front line and supply men. The Allied Supreme Headquarters, fearing that the Communications Zone Command might not become a scapegoat for us, took Lee under protection and shielded him from criticism from the front-line soldiers. The First Army was quite frank in its criticism of the position taken by the Communications Zone Command, and Patton also made no secret of his irritation with Lee's activities. However meagre the rate of ammunition consumption for the armies, we were forced to reduce it still further in order to accumulate sufficient reserves for the November offensive. During the whole of October, our armies had a miserable existence on starvation rations. During this time, the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Forces had to bring the scale of unloading transports with ammunition to 6,000 tonners per day and send the surplus above that to the Army field depots. Although this method of solving the problem was far from perfect, it satisfied Bedell Smith. "The communications zone will be able to meet your requirements and supply you with ammunition by 22nd October, he assured me. "We'll give them another 10 days, I said. "Have them supply us by 2nd November. Bedell was unhappy with my answer, but when 22nd October came and the communications zone could not supply us, he called me and apologized. "I didn't realize it would take so long," he explained, exasperated by the delay. "Think no more of it, Bedell," I said. "We know these people better than you do." In an attempt to earn our favor, the communications zone has once again overestimated its supply capacity. On 14th October, Hodges completed the encirclement of the remaining roofless city of Aiken. On this day we waited for the English king, who was touring the front, and invited the entire senior command staff to the First Army command post. Hodges deployed his command post right on bare ground near a dilapidated castle near the Belgian town of Verviers. At that time, First Army headquarters was the only one of all our higher headquarters still housed in tents. Patton and Simpson had moved their headquarters into buildings as winter approached. Just this day, the 12th Army Group Task Force rolled up its tents at Verdun and moved into a steam-heated building at Luxembourg, just 20 kilometers from the German front line. General Garth went to Monty's command post to accompany King George as he travelled through Belgium to the American sector. Garth had drunk several cups of tea at breakfast and was now feeling terribly uneasy as he drove along the brick-lined, shell-torn roads. He knew that his companions in the jeep were in the same condition and were no less eager than he was to stop. Not knowing how to explain to the king the necessity of stopping, Garth muttered that he had to stop the convoy for sanitary reasons. When the cars were on their way again, the king looked at Garth, smiling. So you said the halt was for sanitary reasons? He turned to his secretary and laughed. Don't forget to put that in our diary. The headquarters of the First Army, on the occasion of the King's visit, had to make a concession to comfort and move their mess tent to an enclosed room. At breakfast in this poorly furnished dining room, Patton occupied his guests with stories of his adventures in Africa. He spoke of the innate propensity of Tunisian Arabs to steal and, sipping coffee, declared to the king, "I have personally shot probably at least a dozen Arabs." Ike winked at me. "How many did you say, George?" he asked. Patton took a drag on his cigar. "Well, maybe only half a dozen," he replied with a sly grin. "How many?" Ike insisted. George shrugged his shoulders, laughed and turned to the king. "At any rate, sir, 2 of them I gave a boot right in the street at Gaff's." In the evening, Eisenhower returned with me to the task force of the 12th Army Group headquarters in Luxembourg. We drove through the Ardennes on forest roads, soaked with dampness after prolonged autumn rains, past the Belgian peat bogs, and past the town of Bastard. There was a field bakery on the outskirts of the town, and there was a tantalizing smell of baked bread in the air. In Luxembourg, old stone buildings were decorated with the national flag and canvases bearing the proud motto, "We want to remain who we are." In the festively decorated streets, coloured lithographs were displayed in shop windows, from which the Grand Duchess Charlotte looked on benevolently. Near the Hotel Alpha, which was our flat, a shopkeeper displayed in his shop window a large photograph of President Roosevelt, but not of Franklin, but of Theodore. In the evening at dinner, Sergeant Dudley brought to the table a huge decorated cake sent from Paris. Eisenhower turned 54 years old that day. 4 days later, on 18th October, as Aiken shuddered under the fire of artillery of the First Army, Eisenhower convened a meeting at the headquarters of the 21st Army Group in Brussels to develop a strategic plan for the November offensive. The meeting was deliberately convened in the vicinity of the location of Monty's command post, so he could not avoid meeting with us. With winter approaching, Eisenhower could choose one of 2 courses of action. 1. He could entrench with his 54 divisions on an 800-kilometer front stretching from the North Sea coast to the Swiss border. By abandoning the November offensive, he could wait until spring, when fresh American divisions would arrive in Antwerp and large reserves would be concentrated to allow a crushing blow. 2. He could have gone on the offensive in November with the troops he had, relying only on supplies that could be delivered by existing communications. But Eisenhower could not wait until the spring, until the Allies finally accumulate the necessary forces and means, because the Germans could outpace us in the pace of build-up. They had already shown us with what astonishing speed they could reconstitute their forces. Each week of Allied troops sitting in the trenches in the autumn gave the Germans the opportunity to equip divisions with new tanks and recruit more Volkssturm and improve their defences. And each month brought new frustrations for Toy Spatz. He was greatly disturbed by the continuing production of jet fighters and the new radio detonators invented by the Germans. Spatz had long before feared that either of these innovations could have driven our bombers out of the airspace. At the same time, the superiority we had on land could not yet ensure our long-term success in the winter offensive. The enemy had already managed to accumulate 32 divisions, which at any moment could appear at the front. Moreover, with the exception of the section of Collins' enclosure in the neighbourhood of Aachen, it was not possible to break through the Siegfried Line in other directions. Still, no one believed that we could passively sit out the entire winter, not to mention the fact that such tactics were fraught with unpleasant consequences, it would certainly cause a sharp protest from our allies in the Kremlin. Ike made his choice partly on intuition. He reckoned that we would attack the enemy with all our forces and try to dismember his armies west of the Rhine. Perhaps when we reach the Rhine, the morale of the Reich will be broken and we will end the war. General Marshall had even earlier dared to express this same faint hope. Both Eisenhower and I clung to it, although we felt all its ephemeral. Eisenhower's decision to resume the offensive in November again revived the endless arguments between Montgomery and I on the comparative advantages of striking in one or two directions. Again, Monty demanded that Eisenhower muster all forces for a concentrated offensive on the Ruhr north of the Ardennes. And again I insisted that he strike in two directions, at the Ruhr and the Saar, giving Patton the opportunity to invade the Saar industrial area, which was in the path of the advance to the Rhine. Although we continued to bicker over the nature of the offensive just west of the Rhine, we both understood perfectly well that this decision would also determine the nature of a further offensive east of the Rhine. Monty still continued to defend his plan to attack along the northern border of the Ruhr in one direction, while I advocated a two-pronged coverage of this industrial center of the Reich. Monty argued that American troops were to reach the Rhine only in the area north of Cologne, including Cologne. I, on the other hand, argued that we should occupy the entire west bank of the Rhine before thinking of any offensive east of it. In the end, Eisenhower had to choose between these two opposing views. My arguments in favor of a double strike were very simple. If Eisenhower launched the November offensive in only one direction north of the Ardennes, the enemy would in turn concentrate all his defenses there. On the other hand, if we divided our forces and implemented a two-pronged coverage, sending one covering group in the direction of Frankfurt, we would put the enemy in a difficult position and better use the superiority of our armies in maneuverability. Patton was most interested in this, for if Montgomery's point of view prevailed, the Third Army would be forced to confine itself to defensive action south of the Ardennes, and would probably be stuck behind the Moselle River until the end of the war. Could not Patton's divisions be more judiciously utilized by moving them on the Saar? I asked the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force. This time Ike apparently leaned in favor of a two-pronged coverage of the Ruhr. According to his plan, the 12th Army Group should go on the offensive by the 1st and 9th Armies north of the Ardennes, and the 3rd Army south of this forest barrier. All three armies were tasked to make their way to the Rhine and try to seize crossings across it. Monty, in the first place, was to clear the enemy territory west of the Maas, where he, during the offensive on Arnhem, left in his rear separate centres of resistance. Then he was to break through in the direction of the Ruhr south of Nijmegen in the interfluve of the Rhine and the Maas. The offensive of the 1st and 9th Armies was scheduled to begin on 5th November. The Third Army was to advance on the 10th. In preparation for this new offensive, I withdrew Simpson from the Ardennes front and moved him north of Hodges to a section adjacent to Montgomery's front in Holland. When the 9th Army arrived on our front in early October, I assigned it the less active Ardennes section of the front, intending to use the more experienced 1st and 3rd Armies for the Rhine offensive. 18th October, I left Brussels in full confidence that sooner or later Monty will achieve the strengthening of his group of armies at the expense of American troops. By this time, there were twice as many American troops as British troops, and this ratio in favor of the Americans was soon to increase still further. Simpson's army was still the most inexperienced of our armies, and I concluded that it was the one we could hand over to Monty most painlessly. In order not to leave the First Army in a dangerous neighborhood with the British, I decided to wedge between it and Monty's 9th Army, which I did. But this regrouping of my forces ultimately proved to be in Monty's favor. for the Ninth Army soon became a first-class fighting unit, and Monty had much less trouble with it than he would have had with the First or Third Armies. To fill the unoccupied section of the front in the Ardennes forests, we transferred Middleton's 8th Corps from Brest, incorporating it into the First Army. All 3 infantry divisions and the Corps cavalry group we placed in a single line along the 145-kilometre stretch of the front in the Ardennes, in the gap between the advancing armies of Hodges and Patton. To reinforce this weak section of the front, we additionally allocated an armoured division, which Troy transferred to the Corps Reserve. Trout-rich streams rushed down the steep slopes of this quiet section of the front, and the forests were alive with the roar of wild boars. Later, a senior Luxembourg forester complained that American soldiers, who dreamed of roasting wild boar carcasses, hunted wild boars in aeroplanes and shot the unfortunate animals with Thompson machine guns in a hunting frenzy. Inventive, I agreed, but not too dangerous a pastime. Opposite the Ardennes section of Middleton's front lay the picturesque, sparsely populated Eifel Mountains, with their narrow valleys, steep wooded slopes, lakes and extinct volcanoes. Only a few first-class east-west roads crossed the Middleton section from the Eifel through the Ardennes, winding along valleys that stretched to the Maas River 80 kilometres to the rear. We could now strengthen Middleton's front only by weakening our groupings for the November offensive in the north and south. Hodges and Simpson could use no more than 14 divisions on the entire 90-kilometre front north of the Ardennes. South of the Ardennes, Patton's 9 divisions were stretched over a 135-kilometre front. We were so acutely short of manpower that we were forced to postpone the offensive in the northern direction for a full week to demand the return of the division allocated by Monty, which was to take part in the action to free the mouth of the Scheldt from the enemy. Moreover, to concentrate the forces of the Third Army on a narrower section of the front required the transfer of part of Patton's front to Devers' 6th Army Group. If we wanted to minimize the risk of an enemy attack on the weak section of Middleton's front in the Ardennes, we could have postponed Patton's offensive, as Monty suggested, or even sat back in defense all winter. I could not agree to either. Better we should stretch Middleton's front to the limit, deliberately taking risks in the Ardennes for the sake of being able to use every available division in the November offensive, which was to deal the Germans a crushing blow. Thus we deliberately refused to reinforce the front in the Ardennes to ensure the success of the winter offensive. This calculated risk lay on my conscience, and I have never regretted having taken it. If I found myself in the same position again, I would make no other choice. Of course it was not a safe choice, but if we in France had thought only of safety, we might have wintered on the Seine in front of the charred hulk of Paris. It was originally intended that the northern offensive would begin 5 days ahead of Patton's offensive, to enable Hodges and Simpson to be the first to take advantage of strategic air support. We intended to make a massive bombardment in this main direction, once paralyzed the enemy at Saint-Lô. Having learned that Monty is not going to return to 5th November attached to him the American division, I postponed for 5 days the beginning of the offensive in the northern direction and gave Patton the order to take the initial positions. Patton waited 3 days in vain for good weather at his command post in Nancy. Finally, having lost his last hope of stopping the rain, he decided to move out without air support. On the rainy morning of 8th November, he rushed to the offensive. Limited to artillery preparation, his army numbered 220,000 men. George intended to force the Moselle north of Metz, knock the enemy out of this fortified city, go to the Saar Valley and break through the line Siegfried. The distance from Metz to the Saar Valley, about 65 kilometers, from the Saar Valley through the Palatinate to the banks of the Rhine 130 kilometers. For several weeks the heavy rains had been persistent, and the water level in the Moselle had risen to a 50-year high. The turbulent stream demolished all the crossings, and for 5 days Patton moved his troops across the Moselle on rafts and dingy landing craft. On 11th November I called George to wish him a happy birthday. He told me that a bomb company had been fighting the raging river for 2 days trying to build a pontoon bridge. When the bridge was bridged, a self-propelled anti-tank unit drove onto its steel plates in an attempt to cross to the opposite bank. Not far from the other bank, the launcher suddenly drove off the bridge and tore off the rope securing the bridge to the bank. In an instant, the bridge plunged into the water and was carried downstream. The whole company just sat there in the mud, Patton said, and the soldiers squealed as loudly as little children. Further north, on the 1st and 9th Army front, the weather was no better. It was 3 days after the scheduled date for the advance, but the weather still had not improved. I gave a postponement until the 17th of November. If the weather did not improve by then, it would have to be decided whether we could advance without air support, relying on artillery alone as Patton had done. Heavy bombers were based in England, fighter bombers in Belgium. In the event that the weather would not allow aircraft to support us simultaneously from England and Belgium, we were prepared to limit ourselves to support only heavy bombers, refusing to use fighters and postponing the start of the offensive, if necessary until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Our plan called for Hodges' breakthrough to Duren, supported by Simpson operating on the left, forcing the Ruhr River 25 kilometers east of Aki Economie in Cologne, 40 kilometers east of the Ruhr. The main objective of this offensive was to destroy German troops west of the Rhine. In case of defeat of the enemy, we would be able to ford the Rhine with a move, as we ford the Seine. We began bombing bridges over the Rhine to delay the transfer of reinforcements to the West Bank. All the bridges were prepared by the Germans to be blown up in case of retreat. So, when on 5th November a bomb, dropped from our fighter plane, exploded close to the bridge, it caused detonation of charges laid under the bridge. No sooner had the astonished pilot come to his senses than the bridge exploded and collapsed into the water. I calculated that in 30 days after the beginning of the offensive we will go to the Rhine, provided that the first throw will provide us with a breakthrough through the fortifications located directly behind Aachen. However, I warned the headquarters of the army group that if the offensive stalled, we may have to entrench and wait until spring. And the spring offensive, according to my calculations, could lead to the fact that the war would drag on until the autumn of 1945. On 14th November, after 13 days of continuous inclement weather, I left Luxembourg for Spa via Bastogne to share with the First Army the hours of languid waiting. The first wet snow lay a white carpet in the Ardennes. The First Army had just recently moved its headquarters to the fashionable baths of Spa, 20 kilometers from the German border near Aachen on steep hills. The streets of Spa were jammed with people and vehicles bearing the First Army's identifying insignia. Lorries were breaking bushes and spoiling flower beds on the boulevards. The floors of the stately Hotel Britannique, where the army repair shop was based, were traced with red clay stuck to the boots of American soldiers. Folding tables were scattered throughout the casino, where European nobility had once played cards under huge crystal chandeliers that descended from high ceilings. The richly carpeted cocktail lounge had been converted by the First Army Medical Service into a dental office, with foot-powered field dental chairs. All sorts of medical instruments were laid out on a polished mahogany counter. Frustrated by the inclement weather, which had already delayed the offensive by more than a week and a half, Hodges decided to launch the operation on 17th November. With or without air support, he said. We're going to start anyway. Don't worry, General Quesada assured him. When you start the offensive, our planes will be in the air, even if they have to make a forced landing on the way back. On the evening of 15th November, I was sitting with Hodges' staff officers in the operations room at the Britannic Hotel. Hodges and Keane were smoking, blowing rings of smoke. Thorson looked tired, his face drained of colour. Courtney, I said, when you get out to the Rhine, send Tabby on holiday to England. Keane cast a displeased look. Thorson intercepted it and parried it. General, perhaps you will give a written order? It will be more reliable that way. At 1:00 in the morning, another weather report was received. At last we were rewarded for our patience. Next day at noon we could begin the offensive. In the morning, during breakfast at the Belgian steel magnate's house, where Hodges had stationed his generals, we looked out the window. Beyond the mirrored panes we could see the bluish hills rolling away to the east. Leaden clouds rose like a theatre curtain, and the blue sky shone through the mist. Soon the sun appeared from behind the clouds. Friends, look at that ball of fire. No, look at it, Hodges shouted. But don't look at it too closely, he called out, as we leaned against the window, or it will fade, or worse, you'll scare it away. At 12:00. 45 minutes, the deafening roar of the engines announced that the aeroplanes had taken to the air strictly on schedule. 1,200 bombers of the 8th Air Army flew in close formation. An equal number of British heavy bombers flew in dispersed combat formation, like night bombers. To avoid bombarding our own troops, as we had at St. Lo, we set up jeeps with marker beacons to mark the front line with vertically directed radar beams. For visual targeting, we raised barrage balloons with red cloth attached to them to a height of 450 meters. In addition, 90mm anti-aircraft guns marked the front line with special smoke shells bursting 600 meters below the height at which the bombers were flying. As a result of these precautions, only a few bombs fell into the position of our troops, and even that was due to a malfunction of the bomb holders. Our losses totaled 1 lightly wounded man. Although our bombers managed to upset the fighting order of the enemy's division and riddled the ground with craters, but they could not break through a gap through which infantry and tanks could break through to the Rhine. The Germans had skillfully echeloned their defences in depth, covering them with minefields and defences. Knowing that they had the Rhine at their backs, they fought with such desperation for every lousy village at the crossroads, as if it were at least the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. Meanwhile, Goebbels appealed to von Rundstedt's army in the Rhineland to stand not for life but for death. He stated that if the German soldiers wavered, defeat would be inevitable. Then they would be exiled to labor camps in Siberia. Retreating, the enemy left behind solid ruins. He desperately clung to each position until we did not destroy it. When during interrogation the chief of intelligence asked a young German officer whether they had no pity for their native land, which they were condemning to unnecessary suffering, the prisoner shrugged his shoulders and replied, "Maybe after the war it will no longer be ours, so does it really matter?" During the first 2 weeks of the offensive in the northern direction, we advanced less than 11 kilometers. By the time the 2 American armies finally came out fighting across the bomb-torn plain to the outskirts of Düren and Jülich, it was quite obvious that we were involved in a costly war of attrition. But we calculated that for every one of our wounded or killed soldiers, carried by orderlies in the rain on soaked blankets, the enemy paid in 2 or more killed, captured, seriously wounded. In spite of our successes in this grueling war of attrition, I hated the slaughter in which we were forced to pour blood on every step of our advance. It was here, however, that the enemy had decided to bring his last reserves into action, and therefore it was here that we had to break his back if we wanted to force the Rhine. It followed that if we succeeded in defeating the Germans west of the Rhine, they would not be able to stop us east of it. The offensive in the northern direction continued throughout November. Meanwhile, intelligence reported that the enemy was concentrating strong tank reserves in our path. Some tank units were identified. They were part of the 6th SS Panzer Army. We concluded that these tanks would probably be waiting for us at the Ruhr River and would strike us during the crossing, for it was at this point that they could confuse us and upset our plans. We had already resigned ourselves to the prospect of bloody fighting between the Ruhr and Rhine rivers. I told Smith about the concentration of enemy reserves. I would only welcome a counterattack of the enemy, I said. We could put down a lot more Germans at a much lower cost if they came out of their holes and rushed at us in an attempt to change the course of the war in their favour. The enemy's concentration of large reserves has forced me to reconsider the original plan to go to the Rhine in 30 days. If we have to walk on the corpses of the Germans, our advance will take a little longer. But the enemy's losses will more than pay for this delay. Between the rivers Ruhr and Rhine runs a plateau up to 50 kilometers wide. Forming the Cologne Plain, it is an ideal place for a massive tank counterattack. If von Rundstedt strikes during the crossing of the Ruhr River, he may be able to halt our advance to the Rhine and even hold us at this point throughout the winter. Certainly he could not miss such an opportunity. In any counterattack on the Cologne Plain, von Rundstedt could count on such a powerful means as the explosion of the dams on the Ruhr River. While these gigantic structures were in his hands, he could at any moment blow them up, and then our bridges would be swept away by the turbulent flood. The isolated Allied bridgeheads in the Cologne Plain would have been hit. According to engineers, the explosion of the 54-metre-high Schwammenau Dam would have raised the water level in the Rohre Aduren by 8 metres, with violent torrents of water spilling over 2.5 kilometres. It goes without saying that we could not venture any operation west of the Ruhr River without first capturing or destroying these dams. The dams were located in the highlands of the Schnee Eifel, in the mountainous forested area through which our offensive route passed. In preparation for the general offensive, Hodges attempted to capture these dams with the 28th Division on 2nd November. He almost achieved his objective, but was forced to retreat when the Germans counterattacked the 28th Division and knocked it out of the town of Schmidt. It was not until 3 months later that we finally captured the dams and secured a safe crossing of the Ruhr River. Had we captured them in early November and crossed the Ruhr, the enemy would never have dared to launch a counter-offensive in the Ardennes. While Hodges was entrenched on mud-covered heights from which the Ruhr River could be seen, and prepared the First Army to attack the dams through the Gürchen forest, Patton battled his way to the Saar, pressing on the retreating enemy. On 20th November he surrounded Metz, and after the surrender of this fortress closely approached the Saar River. In the evening of 2nd December, Patton forced the Saar in the area of Saarlotten and, crossing the border of Lorraine, entered the territory of the Reich, wedged into a small depth in the Siegfried Line. Patton, by his offensive in the southern direction, proved all the deep validity of the American strategy of double strike. Had he suffered a setback at Saar, Montgomery could freely claim that this offensive in the auxiliary direction was only a poorly conceived maneuver designed to divert the enemy's attention from the direction of the main attack. Delighted at Patton's success in the south after so much disappointment in the north, I congratulated him and asked him to convey my best wishes to the division commanders. George quacked with pleasure. "By golly," he said, "a division commander doesn't need to know everything. As long as he's a fighter, why the devil should he?" I objected to George's belittling of the difficult role of division commanders, but agreed that my greatest wish was that all divisions be commanded by real fighters. As December approached, American casualties began to mount, and the arrival of new replenishments almost ceased. The infantry companies at the front were short-staffed, and finally, in December, it came to a point where divisions were going into the attack with usually a 25% shortage of infantrymen. To make up for the losses, and to stop further reduction in the number of infantry units, we combed the rear in the European theatre of operations, looking for reserves. However, the hastily trained infantrymen, hastily transported by lorry to the front, were not enough and could not replace all the wounded who were brought to meet them in ambulances. The loss of manpower continued. On 15th December, the head of the personnel department reported that the 12th Army Group lacked 17,000 riflemen to man the 31 divisions at the front. This shortage in manpower forced us to slow down the pace of advance, and our troops advancing in the northern direction stuck in the mud. If I had moved some of the troops of the Third Army to the north to reinforce Hodges' army to intensify its action, I would still not have been able to provide both armies with sufficient reserves. During any 5 weeks of the winter offensive, we lost 64,000 men, and almost half of them on a 20-kilometre stretch of the front of the First Army. On top of that, as if combat losses alone were not enough, about 12,000 men fell ill with rheumatism of the legs and were also out of action. Although the rheumatism patients were categorized as non-combat losses, rheumatism nevertheless caused us heavy damage at the front, where every disabled soldier weakened the power of our offensive. Rheumatism diseases of the legs were caused by constant dampness and prolonged exposure to water. It led to permanent damage to the peripheral vessels of the lower extremities. Out of 12,000 soldiers who fell ill with rheumatism and were evacuated to the rear, most of them, according to doctors' conclusions, were permanently unfit for combat service. Many remained disabled for life. By the end of January, the rheumatism of the legs had reached such a large scale that the American command was at a standstill. We were totally unprepared for this scourge, partly as a result of our own negligence by the time we began to instruct soldiers in foot care and what to do if their feet got wet. Rheumatism had already spread through the army with the speed of the plague. Only in a few divisions of the army groups the percentage of the disease was relatively small, because the commanders of these divisions were more diligent. They installed special dryers in which socks were dried daily. When the first autumn rains came in November and the cold weather began, our troops were ill-prepared for the winter campaign. The September supply crisis was partly to blame for this, for during our rapid advance to the Rhine I had deliberately favoured ammunition and petrol loads over winter clothing loads. The result was that we were without warm clothing. The lack of warm footwear was particularly acute. We had put ourselves at risk by going for it, and now suffered for our indiscretion. From the experience of previous battles, we had come to the conclusion that the infantry platoons suffered the greatest losses. It is they who must be the first to rush to the attack under enemy fire. It is they who bear the greatest burdens of war, expose themselves to greater risk, and have less chance of survival than soldiers of other branches of the army. World War II American Infantry Division consisted of 81 infantry platoons, with each platoon having a combat strength of approximately 40 men. Of the division's total strength of 14,000 men, the infantry platoons had 3,240 men. In a field army with a total strength of 350,000 men, there were more than 6 soldiers of other specialities per soldier in a trench. This, of course, does not mean that the other 6 soldiers did not participate in combat. Many of them fought as machine gunners, artillerymen, sappers and tankers, and on a theatre-wide scale the ratio was even higher. For every infantryman with a rifle, there were 15 soldiers of other specialties. Before the invasion of Normandy, we believed that 70% of combat losses would be infantry. By August, we had increased this figure to 83%, based on the experience of the Normandy fighting. A convincing illustration of the danger to an infantryman's life in battle is the fighting at St. Lo, where during 15 days the 30th Division's combat losses totaled 3,934. At first glance, it might appear that all units of the division averaged 25% casualties. In fact, this was not the case. 3 out of every 4 killed or wounded were infantry platoons. Thus, the losses suffered by the infantry platoons exceeded 90%. As soon as we entered French territory, the theatre resupply service became a thorn in our side. So much effort and money was expended in moving reinforcements to the front that we were soon forced to overhaul the whole system, taking the resupply service out of the communications zone and creating an independent Army resupply command. Ike put Lieutenant General Ben Lear in charge of replenishment training. At first, the replenishments were sent directly to the front to infantry units. Therefore, casualties among the newly arrived soldiers far exceeded those of the veterans who had already gained combat experience. Many of them arrived at the front line at night and were killed before dawn. Some were wounded and evacuated to the rear, not having learnt the name of their squad leader properly. By the autumn of 1944, we had changed this order, and newly arriving resupplies were given special training in the division before going to the front lines. Among American troops, the resupply bodies soon gained notoriety because of the inadequate training of the resupplies and the rough treatment of the officers. Fearing that such a system might not have a harmful psychological effect on the troops, Lee, as deputy commander of troops in the theatre, began to look hard for ways to treat the resupply bodies more humanely and to streamline their operations. He suggested starting with a name change. Colonel Franey, Chief of Personnel, Theatre Headquarters, believes, and I quite share his view. He wrote to me that the word replenishment seems to imply cannon fodder. This can easily be avoided by replacing it with another term, say, specialists. Would you have any objection to our renaming the replenishment system as a system or corpus of specialists? Such a naming of our system would give the soldiers who receive the grade of specialist a sense of pride and satisfaction. It seemed to me ridiculous to attempt to solve such a complex problem with a simple change of words. It could have been solved by assigning more experienced officers to the replenishment bodies, the way to raise the morale of newly arriving soldiers. I wrote back, is not to change the name, but to take proper care of these soldiers and make them feel that someone is interested in their plight. Lee reconsidered Franey's offer and soon rejected it. The lack of infantry resupply was felt with increasing urgency, and by December it was beginning to give me serious concern. I asked Ike to send the Chief of Personnel on my staff to Washington to discuss the problem with his counterpart in the Pentagon. But not only did Washington not help us find a way out, but in November, when demands for resupply increased, the War Department cut our consolidated monthly resupply request from 80,000 to 67,000. At the moment when we needed reserves the most, too many soldiers were being sent to the Pacific theater of war. Don't they realize, I complained to Ike, that we could still lose the war in Europe? They'll have plenty of time to clear the Pacific of the Japanese after we finish the war here. Eisenhower knew more than I did about the pressure MacArthur was putting on the Pentagon to accelerate the buildup of forces for decisive action in the Pacific, but he did nothing to show his concern. Indeed, MacArthur and the Pacific were so far removed from our day-to-day problems that we only thought of them in connection with some other shortage that reminded us of the existence of another theatre competing with us for resources. This shortage of human resources was only one link in the chain of disasters that hit us that autumn. The resupply crisis was preceded by a crisis in ammunition and tanks. I am inclined to assume I wrote to Patton in December that someone in Washington has made an incorrect prediction as to the timing of the end of the war in Europe. At the same time, I warned Ike that unless proper action was taken in the near future to deal with the resupply crisis, the offensive power of our infantry divisions would be reduced to zero. In mid-November, the Chief of Intelligence reported that the 6th SS Panzer Army had been moved from its concentration area in Westphalia to an area near Cologne. Another tank army, according to reports, was concentrated slightly to the north. Von Rundstedt's intentions to attack us during the forcing of the Ruhr were so clear that we should have treated them with a certain distrust. But if anyone on the Western Front and saw in these preparations the intention of the Germans to mislead us as to the true direction of their strike, he certainly did not share with me his suspicions. In assessing von Rundstedt's offensive capabilities, we concluded that any counter-offensive by him could only be undertaken for the limited purpose of disrupting our advance towards the Rhine. Any other broader plans, we calculated, would have far exceeded the enemy's capabilities. Although we had suffered heavy losses during the November offensive, enemy losses were even greater. According to intelligence, enemy losses, not counting prisoners of war, totaled 100,000 men in 5 weeks. Only the Third Army Patton during the fighting in the Saar captured 35,000 German soldiers, and officers 22,000 Germans were captured by the troops of Hodges and Simpson. Giving an assessment of the situation at the front on 10th December, the Chief of Intelligence of the First Army wrote, "It is quite obvious that von Rundstedt directs the fighting without intuition and with great skill spares his troops. Preparing to apply all combat means in the most important direction and at the right moment to ensure the defense of the Reich west of the Rhine by inflicting maximum losses on the Allies. There is reason to believe that this most important direction will be the space between Ruhrmund and Schleiden, and concentrated in this fork of the German forces will be thrown against the Allied armies, which, in the opinion of the German High Command, are the most dangerous threat to the successful defense of the Reich." By fork, the First Army Command meant a 72-kilometre stretch extending from the Ruhr dams north of the Ardennes to where the Ruhr flows into the Meuse in Montgomery's Strip. Having assessed the enemy's forces and means which he could field against the First Army, Hodges drew the following conclusions as to possible German action. 1. The enemy may linger on the line where he is at the moment, that is, on the Ruhr River and to the south, on the Siegfried Line. 2. He can go on the counter-offensive by air, tanks, infantry, using secret weapons in one of the most important directions at a time when he considers it appropriate. 3. He may withdraw to the Erft River, a shallow water barrier between the Ruhr and Rhine rivers, and then retreat beyond the Rhine, the most impregnable defensive position in Western Europe. 4. He could declare himself defeated and capitulate. The First Army Command concluded that of all these 4 possible options, the second was the most likely. "There is every reason to believe," wrote Dixon, "that if our main forces forcing the Ruhr River without securing control of the dams, the enemy will flood the Ruhr Valley and go on the counter-offensive. The ferocity with which von Rundstedt repulsed our attacks on the dams testified that he was clearly aware of what a powerful tactical weapon he held in his hands. I agreed with the conclusions of the First Army Command and began to explore the possibility of a decisive battle as soon as we forced the Ruhr. Wishing to ensure the timely arrival of reinforcements sufficient to make up for our anticipated losses, I instructed OA to request the appropriate authorities to send reinforcements from the United States on an unscheduled basis. He was also to insist that Washington not limit our infantry requirements and send us adequate resupply immediately. OA was to leave Luxembourg on 16th December and to visit the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force before leaving Paris. I agreed to accompany OA to Versailles, hoping to make the supreme headquarters feel how serious was the task assigned to OA. After all, the success of our January offensive depended on the success of his mission. On Saturday morning, December 16th, the city of Luxembourg was covered with a grey shroud of fog. From the window of the Hotel Alpha, which overlooked a cobblestone square, I looked out at a bomb-damaged warehouse half hidden in the fog. I was not surprised when Hansen called during breakfast to inform me that the Air Force could not operate today. My chauffeur brought up the Cadillac and placed 4 charcoal warmers behind the back seat. Wanting to leave early, on the 4-hour trip to Paris, I decided this time not to have a 9 o'clock briefing in the operations room of headquarters, located 4 blocks from my flat. The road between Verdun and Chalon was icy, and we reduced our speed to 80 kilometers per hour. A tiny Renault jumped out of an alley and almost caused us to swerve into a ditch. The streets of Paris were deserted. The bare trees were wet in the cold rain, and the whole city seemed to shrink from the cold. At OA's suggestion, we stopped for breakfast at the Ritz Hotel, where the Transport Aviation Command had requisitioned a room for its dining room. Arriving at Versailles, we met Eisenhower, who was waiting for us. The day before our arrival, he received official notification of the awarding of the 5th General's Star. The thunder came later that day. A colonel from the Intelligence Division of the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force tiptoed into the room where the meeting was in progress and presented his chief with a telegram. Major General Kenneth Strong, the British Chief of Intelligence at Ike's headquarters, took one look at the telegram and interrupted the meeting. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the enemy had launched a counter-offensive at 5 separate locations along a section of the First Army front. By evening, there was no doubt about the nature of the German counter-offensive. It was by no means a demonstration. It was found that the counter-offensive involved 8 new German divisions. The enemy struck on the front of Middleton's 8th Corps, deep in the Ardennes, the most vulnerable section of the entire Allied front. "Well," Brad said, Bedell Smith, putting his hand on my shoulder, "you wanted a counter-offensive. I think you've got it." I grinned wryly at those words. Yes, I wanted it. But I'll be damned if I wanted it on this scale.